Welcome to the Product Clinic podcast. We are very happy with a guest today with Antonina. She's an expert at quality and regulatory at Star, a consulting firm that is supporting business in strategy, engineering. I'm very proud to have her today because she's an expert in AI, in healthcare, and especially the upcoming AI Act. Welcome, Antonina.
Thank you. Thank you, Tara. It's a pleasure to talk to you today and happy to have this conversation.
I'm super happy to have you. The AI Act is such an important topic that is coming and it's right the corner already. And while I was looking for information online, I found some of your talk and I was like, oh, I want her to be in the podcast. I could learn so much from her and also the community could learn so much from you. Could you tell her a bit about who you are, what you have done so far, and what brings you as an expert in AI and in healthcare?
Yeah, thank you. So, as you already mentioned yourself, I work at a company called Star. So, my current role is head of regulatory consulting. So, in my current role, what we do, we support companies, mainly medical devices, in getting their products to the market. And we support them on different points of their journey from the very beginning, where we help them to define their regulatory strategy, optimal regulatory strategy for global markets, but also implementing that strategy. And since Star is a big software consulting company, our main focus in regulatory support is also around software as a medical device. So we have a lot of experience with AI as a medical device and kind of regulatory reviews of AI. And yeah, so it started a couple of years ago. I mean, quite many years ago, like 10 years ago with software as a medical device. But then a couple of years ago, when it was obvious to us that AI Act will actually pass through, we started building AI management system kind of framework to support our customers and obviously monitoring all other AI updates, like regulation updates, guidelines. So that's our journey. We kind of monitor all the regulatory background, but besides that, as a team, we also have a practical experience of like implementing that and also going through conformity assessment with different market regulators across the globe.
Super. Thanks a lot. And we will dive deep into all this topic and you will try to help us to understand everything. What does it mean today? I think it's very important to talk about AI hack today because, I mean, healthcare organization, health tech organization often are ready with the quality management system. We have a lot of experience in a lot of big company, at least, maybe less in some startup. But when it comes to AI, this is changing a bit the rule of the games. This is very important for us also to get ready for audit and for all this topic. And I really would like to make sure that I already have AI, for instance, in my product that I have on the market, but I still feel like, okay, is this some risk coming with the AI Act? I'm a bit scared, like, okay, how my next audit will go. So before we start, could you help us understand what is the AI Act in Europe and why is it important to have such a regulation?
Okay. So European AI Act is Artificial Intelligence Act, is the first full-scale AI regulation in the world. There are a couple of similar regulations cooked in different other markets, but none of them is yet published. So why AI Act appeared? It was introduced in order to make sure that AI products which are placed on the European market safe to the basic in terms of basic human rights and but also safe to the environment, to the society overall. And AI Act introduces a couple of different requirements. So part of it is first of all, it prohibited some of the practices, AI practices, which may be harmful to the society and users. And this part of the Act is actually already in force starting February this year. Besides that, it also introduces some categorization of AI systems, such as high-risk AI systems. I bet we will speak more about it as we talk today. And like it defines a set of requirements towards how those systems shall be developed and monitored post-market to make them safe. And then it also introduces a concept of general purpose AI model, which is yet another type of systems with their own requirements from AI Act. Similarly, for those people who come from medical device world, we know that European regulations have different regulatory actors defined and their responsibilities. So AI Act is quite similar from that perspective because it introduces a number of different actors like AI deployers, AI authorized representatives, importers, etc., etc. So, and beside that, it also brings some of the ways on how to support companies in innovations and how to boost actually innovation in Europe when it comes to AI. So that is kind of a very high level overview of the regulation.
No, that's good. And I'm happy also you mentioned that it also provide a bit of idea on how we can continue to innovate. At least from a product manager, we always think like, oh no, they bring another regulation that will prevent us to be innovative. This is not necessarily the case. This is also helping us to provide a framework to the great innovation and a bit of regulated.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment. So AI Act, I really don't look at it as an impediment to innovation. I look at it as how can we actually innovate in a safe way? How can we mitigate those risks which could be brought to reality with so powerful technology as AI? So I really believe that it's very important to regulate AI solutions. And I also believe that all markets will eventually catch up with Europe. And that's great to see that Europe was actually the first one to introduce this regulation. And while I've seen a lot of comments on the internet about trying to scare us that there will be no product on the European market or it will block innovation, stuff like that. I really think that they actually came up with quite soft regulation. So in its first version, AI Act was much more, it would be much more difficult to meet the requirements in its first version. In this version, which was actually published in the journal, it is actually quite okay, I would say. It balances well between requirements and how not to make it overwhelming for the companies to actually meet it.
Good. I think I would just like to do a little step back, trying to, because I don't know what the experience is from the listener with the AI Act. And you mentioned different type of categories. What are the different categories for an AI system?
I already mentioned previously, there are some prohibited AI practices. Some kinds of application of AI are simply not acceptable and prohibited from being placed in the market in European Union. Some example of those are different AI models which could introduce some manipulative practices in order to distort human behavior for some financial games, which could end up harming the user. Another example is different online facial scraping databases or potentially some AI systems which will target specific subgroup of users by their either by age or gender or whatever else as a group, vulnerable group, and basically take benefit of it. So those kind of practices will be prohibited. Another category of systems introduced by AI Act, high-risk AI systems. So high-risk AI systems, we will speak about it, I think, let's just call it high risk for now. We will speak about different components to it a bit later. But generally, those high-risk AI systems have the majority of basically the requirements from AI Act, along with quality management system and other. We can also dive deeper into that a bit later. And then there are non-high risk systems, which potentially may have to meet some transparency requirements. So basically inform their users that they are interacting with AI. And there are also voluntary code of conduct. And on top of it, there are general purpose AI models. And those general purpose AI models has their own very limited set of requirements from AI Act. And they could be also coming in a flavor of general purpose AI model with systemic risk, again, which has some additional yet requirements. So that is like high level overview of what AI Act introduces.
From my understanding, AI in healthcare may very likely to be high risk. Any product in healthcare may very likely to be high risk. Is it true? Am I wrong in my research? Or can you help us to understand what it means for our industry?
That is a good question. Okay, so let me start with telling you what is high-risk AI system under AI Act. So there are two types of high-risk AI systems under AI Act. The first one is AI systems as per main definition, as per main definition of Article 6. So what it says that any AI system which is already regulated by one of the union harmonization legislation, which are listed in Annex 1 AI Act. And if that system or product or safety component to a product shall undergo a third-party conformity assessment under that original legislation, which is listed in Annex 1 of AI Act, that system will be considered high risk. So again, just to make sure that it's clear, if the product is already regulated by any legislation in Europe, which is listed in Annex 1, and it goes through a third-party conformity assessment as part of that original legislation, and it has AI component in it, that product will be considered high-risk AI system under European AI Act. So as an example, you asked specifically about medical devices. If you speak of medical devices, MDR, there are, for example, class 1, class 2A, 2B, 3 medical devices. If you speak of class 1, majority of class 1 devices do not have to go through a third-party conformity assessment procedure. For them, we prepare a self-declaration of conformity, and we have to be compliant with the requirements, but we don't have audit with notified body or conformity assessment. For class 1, if that product is class 1 device under MDR and it does not go through a conformity assessment under MDR, for example, medical device regulation, it will not be considered a high-risk AI system under AI Act. But if we have, for example, class 2A, 2B, or 3 device, which does go through a third-party conformity assessment under European medical device regulation, and it leverages AI in one of its kind of core components, then it will also be considered a high-risk AI system under European AI Act.
Very clear. It's a bit technical, but very clear. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And then if we are a high-risk AI system, I understood you mentioned that there is some requirements that are going to have to be followed. Could you give us some example of what are, on a high level, the requirements?
So in a very simplified way, you can split those requirements into kind of process requirements, product requirements, and post-market release. So in terms of the process requirements, those are different requirements related to how do we control the development of that product. So for example, AI Act requires us to implement quality management system for AI, to implement risk management system, to implement different data governance practices, and also ensure state-of-the-art data privacy and information security. And then beside that, AI Act also introduces some specific requirements related to the product itself. For example, for some kinds of products, it requires transparency for users, so basically informing our users that they are dealing with AI. Or it also requires some specific accuracy, robustness, and cybersecurity measures. And it requires us to implement different logging and recording capabilities in the product to basically meet some specific requirements in the AI Act and enable the oversight of the AI system post-market. And then in terms of the release, for some of high-risk AI systems, we will have to go through a third-party conformity assessment procedure. For some others, it will be internal control, so similar to European MDR self-declaration of conformity. We will have also to register the system in a database similar to UDAMED for medical devices, and also mark the product with CE marking, issue the declaration of conformity. It will be a single declaration of conformity for all different applicable regulations in Europe. And also, obviously, later on, once we place it on the market, there are specific requirements towards oversight, vigilance, and post-market monitoring.
Good. No, that seems to be quite well overview. I was just thinking when you were explaining here, all these requirements, it's somehow something that we are kind of prepared with audit, etc. in healthcare. Can this provide a little competitive advantage to the healthcare company or health tech company to continue innovate versus we see entering now also a lot of tech company into the healthcare field? They might not be as ready as us with this kind of regulation, quality management, etc. What's your view on this?
So first of all, AI Act kind of rolls out its requirements different articles and requirements of AI Act are being rolled out gradually. So those requirements for high-risk AI systems will start being applicable later in 2 years from now, basically. So we still have some time. But as you said, I really agree with you that it's worth start thinking about making quality management systems in the organization already now compliant with AI Act, because obviously it takes time for us to develop the product. And when we develop that product, it should be already controlled and the quality management system compliant with the Act. So it would be a really bad idea to wait till the moment when all those requirements are rolled out. And I think it's worth starting implementing the practices and adjusting to the requirements of AI Act now. And then to the second part of your question, some companies which already have quality management system in place, how I would approach this AI Act compliance, I would start with some kind of gap assessment to understand what are the gaps to be compliant with AI Act, because they have a lot of processes already which might cover quite big part of the AI Act requirements. So the question would be just to adjust. For other companies, obviously, they would have to start from scratch and build some kind of integrated quality information security AI management system.
As you mentioned, I think it's very important to tackle the AI Act requirement right now and not wait too much for it. But unfortunately, sometimes compliance and regulatory can be an afterthought for product people. What I want to understand is what can be the impact for the teams that are waiting and not focusing on the AI Act right now? What are the risks that it could bring to the product and to the company?
First of all, if the companies are not aware about some of the act requirements, for example, like prohibited practices, they can easily place something on the market which is not allowed and then end up with penalties. So AI Act introduces also penalties for non-compliance. Some of those are related with placing prohibited product on the market. Some of those are related to not meeting requirements or providing incorrect information to notified bodies, stuff like that. So, I mean, at least knowing your obligations, it's really important to avoid potential issues. So the first step would be really educating themselves, especially taking into account that one of the articles of AI Act introduces AI literacy. So AI Act requires companies to ensure AI literacy of their employees, depending on their role and responsibilities when it comes to AI. So I think a good idea for the companies would be to start with some kind of AI literacy training for all the employees to just mitigate some risks which could happen with non-compliance or introducing this compliance too late. Another example of issue, like coming back to your question, is, for example, that we develop a system and we miss some important aspects of data management, governance, and then we'll have a supposedly ready product, but it will be not compliant with some of the kind of core requirements like data governance. And it will trigger either a rework or some other issues and delay the time to market. So knowing the requirements even now, I think it's crucial to plan the next couple of years product roadmaps while being informed.
You mentioned about AI literacy for people. Do you know, for instance, could you give some example? What does it mean to have this AI literacy? I'm a product manager in my team or an engineer. What do I need to know?
Let me just read a definition for you. So, AI literacy means skills, knowledge, and understanding that allows providers, deployers, and affected persons, taking into account their respective rights and obligations in the context of this regulation, to make an informed deployment of AI systems, as well as to gain awareness about the opportunities and risks of AI and possible harm it could cause. So this AI literacy, kind of the depth of this training and the AI literacy, I depends really on the responsibilities of a specific person and what they do. For product managers, obviously it should be quite deep, in my opinion, because product managers are those people who are actually driving and deciding on the product roadmap and driving everything. So some, you know, As an example, like we at Star, as a regulatory consulting company, we offer our clients AI literacy training. So as part of the training, what we cover topics such as bias, AI bias, and how to mitigate it throughout the life cycle. Then we obviously cover requirements of AI Act to make people aware. We cover the quality management system or AI management system requirements. We cover different topics related to ability of AI, transparency, robustness of AI, cybersecurity. So it's kind of quite complex end-to-end training, which covers different aspects of AI products and its life cycle.
Great. And I have another topic that you mentioned that I would like to better understand. You mentioned that we can get penalties for non-conformity. Do you have an example of penalties that could be happening?
For example, for placing a prohibited product on the European market, the penalty could be 35 million euro or 7% of the worldwide annual turnover of the company, whichever is higher. With that said, there is a small note that in case it is a small company or startup, then this fine will be whichever is lower. So that is like a small kind of support for startups from the regulators. Another example of it for non-compliance, for introducing an incorrect, incomplete, or misleading information to notified bodies, the penalty could be 7.5 million euro or 1% of the worldwide annual turnover. Again, whichever is higher for bigger companies, whichever is lower for SMEs and startups.
Wow, that's quite important penalty. I was just calculating meanwhile for my company it could be up to 250 million. So I better be literate before.
You better.
I think I think they will make sure I am. No, that's very good. Very
Yeah.
good. No, that's very important because I was discussing, and sometime we're wondering what should we do? Should we just continue as we do today and see if we get a non-conformity and we fix it later? But the penalty that you mentioned are very important, and it's very important to address those topics before and be ready so it can avoid quite significant penalties. There is another thing that you mentioned that we should be literate, so that we should learn how to manage and know how AI is working. Is there any other topic that a product team can do to be ready for the compliance and to prepare themselves as a team?
Think that like understanding that the AI as technology itself, it's important. Like make sure that people understand where the technology is strong, why it's not the best to apply, how it works. In terms of the product teams, as I said, understanding the requirements of the AI Act. But then AI Act as any regulation is also it gives you some requirements, but it does not tell you how to meet those requirements. So potentially exploring some other useful sources of data which could be useful when we kind of implement those compliance systems. So for example, different ISO standards on AI and machine learning or guidelines. There is quite a lot of them now, and they're being published constantly. Every month there is something interesting published from the regulators in different countries. I think like educating yourselves and potentially monitoring what are some risks related to using AI as a technology, trying to be on top of some lessons learned and, instead of making your own mistakes and learning by them, trying to learn from others' mistakes. I think that's a good idea as well.
And there's also one topic that you mentioned as part of the requirement that potentially for me is very important. This is all about the bias. You mentioned that it's an important requirement that we don't bring bias toward gender, age, color skin, whatever. Do you have some example of bias that are introduced in AI system and how to avoid this kind of bias?
So bias is extremely interesting topic for me. And the general perception of bias sometimes is quite limited. And when people think of AI bias, they only think of data and some limitations of the data which we use for training and testing. But generally, bias could be introduced on any step of the ML pipeline. And it is also quite complex to catch. because sometimes you may introduce it and you may be not aware that it's happening. Some examples of how we can introduce bias on the early stages, even on the first step when we define the ML task and define the overall purpose of our system, we may basically state it in a way that it will be biased. So even on that very first moment of when we're coming up with a multitask, it is already important to know about bias. Not speaking of obviously data. So when we speak of data, making sure that it is representative of our end user population and covering different minorities and different subgroups, subpopulations, that's important. But then data processing steps. So during the data processing, sometimes we may have some duplicates in the data, which may, if we split data randomly, some duplicate may end up in training data and other in testing data, which makes so-called data leak and in the end, basically biased assessment of the performance of the system. Another example could be if we, again, have our data and sometimes there are some missing values in the data. How do we basically replace those missing values? And when replacing those and augmenting potentially the data as well, we may again introduce bias by that step. So any data pre-processing work brings a risk of introducing some bias. Another example, like moving towards next steps of AI lifecycle, when we speak of feature engineering. So when we define features as an input for our AI to take basically decision on, how do we make sure that we do not select some features which could be sensitive in terms of, bias potentially towards some groups of people, as you said, like gender, color, skin color, or financial status. Even later on, when we decide on an algorithm selection step, our kind of algorithm which we select should reflect the complexity of the task which we are trying to kind of solve. If we select, for example, speaking of neural networks, if we select too complex, too deep neural network, and our problem is very simple, we may end up having a kind of overfitted model, which will not be reflecting and working well in the production. So, and the bias could be introduced again in many other places. So we speak data labeling, like whom do we use to label the data? How to make sure, what are the incentives of those people? That's why the question of bias is very interesting for me, because it's also very not obvious. And in many cases, it could be hidden in so small and at first glance things that it really needs some very clear process in the organization. How do you manage it? Because that is the only way to somehow mitigate risks related to bias.
Wow, super informative. We could do even a full episode just on bias. So many insights. Maybe for the next one, if you're free again, I'm happy to do another one just for bias. We talked a lot about, okay, what is AI Act, also how to be ready, what the team needs to know. I also know that there is an upcoming compliance deadline for the AI Act in August 2025, if I'm right. What exactly must be ready by then?
In August this year, Chapter 3, 4, 7, and some other chapters of the Act start being applicable. So basically, simply speaking, requirements toward general purpose AI model start being applicable. So in terms of practical recommendation for the companies, I think it's worth just educating yourself what are different categories of products under the Act, and then trying to understand where your product basically ends up being. Is it a general purpose AI model or high risk AI system, or God forbid prohibited AI practice, because it is already worse. But understanding where you are is important, because then you will also be able to trace what is the timeline on when you should be kind of compliant, and obviously what are the requirements.
Good. Another question I have when I was going online trying to understand what I need to do for my product is that I heard that we need also to prepare AI management system. Today we already have a QMS or quality management system in all company, I hope at least, that are listening here and that are already in healthcare. Can you tell us what is this AI management system? How does it differ from a classical QMS we have?
Mhm. So quality management systems aim to manage quality of the product in the end, and they are not specific to technology. And when it comes to AI management system, those systems, for example, ISO 42001, which is a ISO standard describing requirements towards AI management system, it describes a framework on how organizations responsibly develop and use AI solutions. And it is specific to AI as a technology. So, as you know, the conventional software development lifecycle is quite different from the machine learning pipeline. So, AI management system, I wouldn't say that it will completely replace the existing QMS or ISMS in the organization. It will just complement with some additional processes and perspectives which are specific for AI technology. So for the organizations which already have QMS in place, as I previously mentioned, I would start with some kind of gap assessment and I would map the existing processes to the requirements of AI Act or, for example, ISO 42001, which is quite a good standard to use because it's quite informative on different more practical aspects. Even so, it is not a safety-based standard. It is more like a continuous improvement standard. But still, even in Healthtech, you can easily adapt its requirements towards our Healthtech realities.
And finally, we are arriving towards the end of that podcast, but I still have a few questions for you. We have, in the QMS, we have clear role and responsibility. What is the responsibility, for instance, of the product manager? I don't know if you have a more physical product, the labeling manager, what is responsible for the quality management system, etc., etc. In the case of developing an AI product, what is the role of the product manager? What, from your perspective, should I do? How can I contribute in this AI management system, in this AI quality, let's say? What should be my task? Somehow, if you have some guideline you could provide.
So AI management systems and AI Act itself as well requires us to have a clear accountability framework in the organization when it comes to AI. And obviously, product managers as people who drive the product roadmap and scope and overall impact should also have their place there. So, in terms of your role, I think that the first important thing is to actually really understand the requirements, but then also understand what does the requirements from the technical perspective. For example, these logging and recording technical requirement, because it is like a direct input into your software requirements for your team later on. Another perspective is you should really know how to make your AI system transparent, explainable, because again, you transparency and explainability are just very vague terms. But then it will be your task to make those terms tangible in your product and kind of translate it into very clear requirements for your team on how to meet this. So there will be definitely a lot of collaboration between different roles like product managers, regulatory experts, and technical people to meet those high level AI objectives like transparency, etc., etc.
Great. And then maybe to wrap up this podcast, if you have to provide, let's say, in a nutshell, what are the 2, 3 learnings that our listener must keep in mind after this very interesting discussion? What should it be if you have top 1 or top 2 things that we should keep in mind?
So, if you had to remember only 5 sentences from today's podcast, I would say if you leverage AI in your product and your product is already regulated in Europe, and with specific medical devices, for example, if your product is class 2A and higher, then I suggest you to educate yourself on the AI Act requirements and start slowly kind of educating yourself on the different aspects of AI compliance. And potentially good first step could be really a gap assessment towards AI Act, both in terms of product, but also in terms of your management system perspective.
Super. Amazing. Thanks a lot, Antonina, for all the insight and everything that we learned today with you. If we want to know more about AI Act, get support from you or your company, where can we find you? Do you have any channel, website? Where can we find you to get support?
Yeah, so we do have obviously our website, star.global. So on star.global, you can always reach out to us via our forums. Besides that, you can always just reach out directly to me on LinkedIn and we can chat if you have any questions related to medical devices, regulations, compliance, and AI in particular.
Thank you for the conversation, Antonina. And thank you, everybody, for joining this episode today. I hope you enjoyed it. And for the Product Clinic community, stay tuned and we come back very soon. Bye.